In the year 750 BC, the kingdom of Kush stood at a moment of gathered strength. Its center lay at Napata, a settlement pressed against the western bank of the Nile, in the shadow of a flat-topped sandstone mountain the Egyptians had long ago named Jebel Barkal, the Pure Mountain. The kingdom's reach extended from the region above the Sixth Cataract in the south to the fringes of Lower Nubia in the north. Its rulers governed this stretch of river through a combination of riverine administration and pastoral tribute, drawing on cataracts, alluvial pockets, and the desert margins that framed the valley. At the head of this kingdom sat Alara, remembered in later Kushite inscriptions as a founding ancestor of the Napatan royal line. After him came Kashta, whose name in Egyptian rendering meant simply the Kushite. The court at Napata was neither isolated nor unfamiliar with the world downriver. Its temple to Amun at Jebel Barkal had been built and rebuilt across centuries, and by the middle of the 8th century BC, it stood within a religious framework that Kushite rulers themselves treated as their own inheritance rather than as a borrowed idiom. The god who resided in the mountain was, in Napatan understanding, the same Amun who resided at Karnak. The mountain itself was understood as the primordial dwelling from which that god had first emerged. From this ideological foundation, the Napatan kingship claimed a legitimacy that did not depend on Egyptian recognition, though it operated within a shared religious grammar with the Amun priesthood downriver. Kushite rulers styled themselves in Egyptian titulary, wrote monumental inscriptions in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and buried their dead in tumuli that had begun to take on architectural features drawn from Egyptian mortuary practice. What the Napatan court understood about Egypt in that moment was precise and specific. It knew that Egypt was not one country under one king. It knew that the priesthood of Amun at Thebes had, over the preceding 2 centuries, drifted away from any single royal authority in the north. It knew that the office of the god's wife of Amun at Thebes, a celibate priestess-princess whose institutional weight in Upper Egypt had grown as central royal power had thinned, was a potential channel of Kushite influence into the Egyptian heartland. Kashta had already moved to place his own daughter, Amenirtis, into the line of succession for that office. The move was quiet, and it was legal within the terms Egyptian religious institutions themselves recognized. Kushite awareness of Egypt extended further than the Theban region. Napatan rulers received intelligence, through trade caravans and priestly correspondence, about the Libyan-descended dynasties that held Tanis and Bubastis in the eastern delta, about the rising Saite house in the western delta under a chieftain named Tefnacht, and about the Hermopolitan ruler Nimlot who commanded the middle stretch of the river. Kush understood Egypt, in short, as a landscape of competing houses, rather than as a single opponent or a single partner. That understanding shaped what would follow, because it meant that the Napatan court did not see intervention in Egypt as an assault on a unified state. It saw intervention as movement into a field already in motion. At the same moment, seen from the other direction, Egypt stood in a condition its own priests and scribes would later describe as fragmentation without collapse. The country was wealthy. Its temple estates continued to hold land, collect grain, and employ craftsmen. Its irrigation systems continued to function. Its major cities, Tanis, Memphis, Heracleopolis, Hermopolis, Thebes, continued to house populations that measured in the tens of thousands. What Egypt lacked in the middle of the 8th century BC was a single royal authority that all of these cities recognized. The 22nd dynasty, established more than 2 centuries earlier by rulers of Libyan descent, had by this point splintered into multiple parallel lines. Each line claimed pharaonic titulary. None commanded the whole valley. The Egyptian understanding of Kush, seen through the sources Egypt itself produced in this period, was mixed and inconsistent. Older Egyptian textual convention treated Kush as the south, the land of gold, the source of tribute, a region administered by viceroys during the New Kingdom and lost as an administrative province after the withdrawal of Egyptian garrisons in the 11th century BC. That older framing persisted in temple inscriptions and in the ritual vocabulary of kingship, where the pharaoh continued to be depicted symbolically smiting southern enemies regardless of any political reality on the ground. Alongside that inherited image, however, Egyptian priests at Thebes had come to recognize the Napatan court as an Amun kingdom in its own right, one whose rulers spoke the ritual language correctly, funded temple works, and treated the god with the seriousness that Egyptian religious specialists considered the measure of legitimate kingship. To understand how Kush arrived at that position of gathered strength, one has to look back through nearly a millennium of Nubian political history that unfolded independently of Egypt for long stretches and in close entanglement with it for others. The Napatan kingdom did not emerge from nothing in the 8th century BC. It was the latest expression of a political tradition rooted in the Middle Nile, a tradition that archaeologists trace back to the polity centered at Kerma, roughly 100 kilometers upstream of the Third Cataract, which flourished from around 2500 BC and reached the height of its power between about 1700 and 1500 BC. Kerma at its peak had been a walled city with a monumental mud brick temple known today as the Western Defufa, a structure that rose to a height of nearly 19 meters and dominated the surrounding plain. Its rulers had been buried under enormous tumuli, some containing hundreds of retainers interred alongside the king. Kerma had traded with Egypt, fought with Egypt, and at moments of Egyptian weakness had pushed its own frontier well to the north. Its material culture, distinctive fine ceramics, elaborate leatherwork, and metalwork in copper and gold, is legible in the archaeological record as the product of a society with its own aesthetic vocabulary rather than as a peripheral echo of anything Egyptian. The Kerma state was ended, not gradually but decisively, by the campaigns of the early 18th dynasty pharaohs Ahmose, Amenhotep I, and above all Thutmose I, who pushed Egyptian arms south of the Fourth Cataract in the 16th century BC. What followed was a period of Egyptian occupation lasting roughly 500 years, administered by a viceroy who held the title King's Son of Kush, and who governed from fortified towns at Aniba, Soleb, and Amara West. During this occupation, Egyptian temples were built along the Nubian Nile in numbers that had no precedent, the most prominent being the Amun temple at Jebel Barkal, which Egyptian inscriptions describe as marking the southern limit of the god's dwelling. Egyptian religious ideas, script, and administrative forms entered Nubia not as isolated influences, but as the everyday apparatus of a colonial state. When the Egyptian New Kingdom itself weakened in the 11th century BC and the viceregal administration withdrew, it did not leave behind a vacuum. It left behind a Nubian population that had absorbed a great deal of Egyptian religious and administrative material and had every reason to continue using what worked. The centuries between the withdrawal and the emergence of a documented Napatan state, roughly the 10th and 9th centuries BC, are archaeologically thin. There are no royal inscriptions from this stretch. What can be traced is the continued use of the Amun temple at Jebel Barkal, the persistence of Egyptian-derived pottery forms alongside indigenous ones, and the gradual appearance of a new elite burial ground at El Kuru, a low ridge on the west bank of the Nile, downstream of Napata. The El Kuru cemetery is where Kushite political history becomes visible again. The earliest graves there are simple tumuli, in a form continuous with older Nubian burial practice. Over successive generations, the tombs grew larger, acquired stone chapels, and eventually took on rectangular superstructures. By the time of Alara, in the earlier 8th century BC, the burials at El Kuru had become recognizably royal in scale and organization. What archaeologists reconstruct from this cemetery, together with references in later Napatan inscriptions, is a lineage of local rulers who had consolidated authority over the reach of the Nile around the Fourth Cataract, and who traced descent through the female line, a pattern of matrilineal succession that would remain a distinctive feature of Kushite kingship for centuries. Alara himself left no known inscriptions. What is known of him comes from references in the later stelae of his successors, who invoked him as the ancestor from whom their legitimacy descended and who was credited with dedicating female members of his family to the service of Amun. His sister, Pabachma, was the mother of Kashta, and it was through this line that the Napatan royal house understood its authorization to rule. Kashta's reign, dated approximately to the second quarter of the 8th century BC, is the first for which contemporary inscriptions survive. A stela of his was recovered at Elephantine, at the traditional southern boundary of Egypt proper, on which he styled himself with the full Egyptian royal titulary, including the epithet Beloved of Khnum, the god of the First Cataract. The stela is fragmentary, but its implication is not. Kashta had extended his authority to the Egyptian frontier and had claimed pharaonic legitimacy in the vocabulary Egyptian religious institutions themselves used. The Napatan state that Kashta ruled combined several elements that had not been combined before in Nubian history. It held a stretch of the Middle Nile long enough to control both upstream pastoral zones and downstream agricultural pockets. It possessed, in the Amun temple at Jebel Barkal, a religious institution that gave it standing within a wider Nile Valley theological world. It maintained a working literacy in Egyptian hieroglyphs, employed for royal inscriptions and temple dedications. And it had access to material resources: gold from the deserts east of the Nile, cattle from the savannas to the south, hardwoods, ivory, and slaves from further upriver, that gave it economic weight independent of any relationship with Egypt. The organization of Napatan kingship rested on the temple as much as on any secular apparatus. Coronation, according to later Napatan royal inscriptions that describe the practice in detail, involved a journey to the sanctuary at Jebel Barkal, where the king was recognized by the oracle of Amun in a ceremony that treated the god as the active selector of the ruler. Kingship was thereby framed as delegated authority rather than as inherited property, even though succession in practice followed the royal lineage. The oracle mechanism gave the priesthood significant influence over political outcomes and also gave the king a form of legitimation that no purely dynastic claim could match. While the Napatan court had spent the preceding century assembling the ingredients of a consolidated state, Egypt, during the same span, had been moving in the opposite direction. Its political architecture had grown steadily more layered and more decentralized, and by the middle of the 8th century BC, the country contained not one royal seat, but at least half a dozen centers, whose rulers each claimed some version of pharaonic authority. This was not a condition of collapse. It was a stable pattern of distributed sovereignty that had lasted long enough to become the way Egypt worked. The roots of the pattern lay in the aftermath of the New Kingdom. When the 20th dynasty ended around 1070 BC, effective authority in the country had already divided between a royal line at Tanis in the eastern delta and a hereditary priesthood of Amun at Thebes that governed the south as a temple state. This arrangement, conventionally called the 21st dynasty period, established the precedent that Egypt could function with two parallel authorities, one royal and one priestly, each recognizing the other's legitimacy without either subordinating itself. The precedent shaped everything that followed. Around 945 BC, a Libyan-descended commander named Shashank I, whose family had held military positions in the delta for generations, took the throne at Tanis and founded what is now called the 22nd dynasty. Shashank's line was Libyan in origin but Egyptian in institutional form. Its members adopted full pharaonic titulary, sponsored temple construction at Karnak and Bubastis, and for a time reasserted a degree of central authority. Shashank I himself campaigned in the Levant, and his name appears in the biblical account of the sack of Jerusalem under King Rehoboam. For roughly a century, the 22nd dynasty gave Egypt something close to unified rule. That unity did not survive the accumulated pressures of Libyan succession politics. The Libyan population that had entered Egypt over the preceding centuries had retained a segmentary social structure organized around chieftains of the Meshwesh and Libu confederations. Each generation of the 22nd dynasty produced additional royal sons and cousins who were placed as governors, high priests, or army commanders in cities across the Delta and Middle Egypt. Over time, these placements became hereditary. By the reign of Shashank III in the later 9th century BC, the descendants of these lines had begun to claim royal titles in their own right in their own cities, without renouncing formal loyalty to the Tanite king. The result, by the middle of the 8th century BC, was a country in which pharaonic titulary had proliferated. At Tanis, the 22nd dynasty continued under a king named Osorkon IV, whose actual territorial reach had shrunk to the eastern delta around his capital. At Leontopolis, in the central delta, a parallel line now recognized as the 23rd dynasty ruled under a king named Ayuput II. At Hermopolis in Middle Egypt, a ruler named Nimlot held the traditional cult center of Thoth and styled himself king. At Heracleopolis, further south, a ruler named Pefjawawibast controlled the entrance to the Fayum. Smaller principalities under chieftains bearing the Libyan title Great Chief of the Ma held towns across the delta, including Mendes, Sebenitos, Busiris, and Athribis. Each of these polities minted its own inscriptions, maintained its own temples, and conducted its own local administration. The most consequential of these delta powers, in terms of what was about to happen, was the Western Delta Principality of Sais. Sais had been a secondary center under earlier dynasties, but by the middle of the 8th century BC, it had come under the rule of a chief named Tefnacht, whose title in his own inscriptions combined the Libyan Great Chief of the Ma with the Egyptian Prince of the West. Tefnacht was not a king in the fullest sense at the outset of his career. What distinguished him was his willingness to move against the pattern of distributed sovereignty and to attempt reunification from the north. Over roughly a decade, he brought the western delta towns under his direct authority, absorbed the Libyan chieftaincies of the central delta into alliance or submission, and pushed south along the western branch of the Nile toward Memphis. Memphis itself, the ancient administrative capital at the apex of the delta, was in this period held by no single ruler. It functioned as a religious and commercial center under the management of its own priesthood of Ptah, and served as a strategic prize rather than as a seat of royal power. Whoever held Memphis controlled the point at which the Nile Valley opened into the delta, and Tefnacht's southward push was aimed at exactly this point. By the late 730s BC, his forces had crossed into Middle Egypt and had begun to receive submissions from the smaller principalities along the river. Nimlot of Hermopolis, who had previously been aligned with the Kushite-influenced south, transferred his allegiance to Tefnacht. Pef-Joawibast of Heracleopolis came under siege. The situation in Upper Egypt was different in character. From Thebes southward, no Libyan-descended dynasty had established the kind of hereditary local rule that dominated the delta. Thebes was governed effectively by the Amun priesthood in cooperation with the office of the god's wife, which by this point held estates equal in scale to those of the temple itself. The fourth prophet of Amun, a hereditary official named Montuemhat, exercised the practical civil authority over the city and its surrounding nomes. Montuemhat's own inscriptions describe him as governor of the southern city and overseer of Upper Egypt, and his tomb, one of the largest non-royal tombs constructed in Egypt during this period, indicates the scale of resources at his disposal. The Theban establishment's alignment with Kush, mediated through the god's wife office, was not a formal political subordination. It was an institutional understanding, in which the Napatan court underwrote the continuity of Theban religious governance, and the Theban priesthood, in turn, recognized Kushite legitimacy in the vocabulary that mattered most to it. What this meant in practice was that when Tefnacht's forces pushed south and Hermopolis switched sides, the Theban establishment and its Kushite backers now faced a delta coalition that had crossed into their zone of influence. The pattern of distributed sovereignty had held for a long time, precisely because none of its components had attempted to reunify the country by force. Tefnacht was now attempting exactly that. Between two political worlds preparing, without yet knowing it, to collide, there existed a corridor of exchange that had been operating continuously for several centuries. The Nile itself was the primary channel, but it was not the only one. Desert tracks paralleling the river on both banks, the routes across the Bayuda that shortened the Great Bend between the 4th and 6th cataracts, and the caravan roads connecting the Nile to the Red Sea coast all carried goods, people, and information between the two spheres. Understanding what each side knew about the other in the years immediately preceding the campaign of Piye requires looking at these channels and at what moved along them. The material trade is the most straightforward part of the record. Gold moved north from the mines of the Wadi Alaki and the eastern desert beyond Kush, refined at Kushite workshops, and passed downriver to Egyptian temples and treasuries in the form of ingots, ornaments, and ritual objects. Ivory, ebony, incense resins, animal skins, and ostrich feathers moved north as high-value goods that Egyptian temple economies converted into ceremonial equipment. Cattle moved north on the hoof, driven along the riverbank tracks. Enslaved people, drawn from populations further south than the Kushite core, moved north as household labor and as temple dependents. In the opposite direction, Egyptian workshops sent linen textiles, faience amulets, bronze ritual vessels, and certain classes of finished stone objects, cosmetic palettes, small statuary, offering tables, into Nubian markets. Papyrus for administrative use went south. So did wine in sealed jars, some of it imported into Egypt from the Levant, and then re-exported further up the Nile. What is easy to overlook is how much information moved along these same channels. Merchants who traveled the length of the Nile carried news of political developments as a matter of professional necessity. The Amun Temple network, which maintained correspondence between Karnak, Napata, Kawa, and smaller sanctuaries along the river, moved letters and ritual instructions in both directions on a regular basis. Priests trained at one temple often served at another. The god's wife of Amun institution at Thebes, once Ammonirtis had been placed within its succession, functioned as a continuous point of contact between the Napatan court and the Theban establishment. What the Kushite court knew about Egyptian factional politics, and what the Theban priesthood knew about developments in the Napatan royal house, flowed through these institutional connections rather than through any diplomatic apparatus in the modern sense. The Kushite understanding of Egypt, so far as it can be reconstructed from later Napatan royal inscriptions and from the pattern of Kushite actions, was accurate on several counts. Kushite rulers understood the distinction between the Amun-centered religious world of Upper Egypt and the more diverse religious landscape of the Delta, where the cults of Bastet at Bubastis, Neith at Sais, and the Ram of Mendes held authority independent of Ammon. They understood that Libyan-descended dynasties in the north did not command automatic religious legitimacy in the south. They understood the strategic importance of Memphis as the hinge point of the valley, and they understood that the Delta was a landscape whose channels, marshes, and fortified cities made military movement through it slow and costly. On other counts, the Kushite reading appears to have been less complete. The internal political dynamics of the Libyan chieftaincies, the specific loyalties, the personal rivalries, the marriage alliances that linked the ruling houses of Tanis, Leontopolis, Bubastis, Mendes, and Sais do not seem to have been mapped in detail at Napata. Kushite sources describe the Delta rulers as a collective when they describe them at all. This is not necessarily a failure of intelligence. It may reflect a Kushite judgment that the internal distinctions among Delta houses did not matter for the purposes of a campaign that would treat them all as subjects to be brought into submission. Whether this judgment was correct, or whether it obscured opportunities and risks that a finer-grained reading might have revealed, is a question the later course of events would raise. The Egyptian reading of Kush was similarly patterned. The Theban establishment, in continuous institutional contact with Napata, understood the Kushite court reasonably well. It knew the ruling lineage, understood the matrilineal succession, and recognized the theological framework within which Kushite kingship operated. What the Theban priesthood knew about Kush was information that had been accumulating for generations through the shared religious infrastructure. This is why Theban recognition of Kushite legitimacy, when it was extended in terms that were substantively correct rather than merely ceremonial. The Delta rulers' understanding of Kush was thinner and more distorted. Delta inscriptions from the period do not describe Kush as a coherent political actor. When they refer to the south at all, they use inherited vocabulary, the 9 bows, the lands of Nubia, the wretched Kush, that had been carried forward from New Kingdom royal ideology without updating. This vocabulary described Kush as a source of resources and as a symbolic enemy, not as a state capable of independent military action at scale. Tefnacht's own campaign records, as they can be reconstructed from later reports, do not appear to have anticipated a Kushite military response to his northern consolidation. He treated the south as a region under Theban management, and Theban management as a factor that his growing coalition could either absorb or work around. This asymmetry of understanding, the Kushite court with a reasonable operational read on Egypt, the Delta courts operating with an outdated symbolic image of Kush, was one of the structural conditions that shaped what happened next. It was not a matter of one side being more sophisticated than the other, it was a matter of which institutional networks each side was plugged into. Kush was plugged into the Amun Temple network, which carried current information about Egypt as a matter of ordinary function. The Delta rulers were plugged into their own regional networks, which carried current information about each other but treated the south through inherited categories. The campaign that closed the distance between the two spheres began in the 20th regnal year of Piye, dated by most current chronologies to approximately 727 BC. It is documented in a single monumental source of extraordinary density and length, a granite stela nearly 1.5 meters tall, inscribed on all four sides and set up in the temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal. The stela was recovered in the 1800s and now stands in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It contains, in 159 lines of hieroglyphic text, Piye's own account of the campaign. There is no equivalent northern source that describes the same events at comparable length, which means that any reconstruction of the campaign proceeds primarily through the terms Piye himself set. Reading the stela requires taking those terms seriously as a self-representation, while remaining aware that they are a self-representation. The stela opens with a report reaching the Napatan court that Tefnakht had advanced south, that Nimlot of Hermopolis had gone over to him, and that Pef-Joawabast at Heracleopolis was under siege. Piye's first response, according to the text, was not to march north immediately. It was to send instructions to Kushite garrisons already stationed in Upper Egypt, ordering them to relieve Heracleopolis and to check Tefnakht's advance. Only when initial engagements failed to produce a decisive result did Piye assemble the main army and move north himself. The text emphasizes that before departure he made offerings at the temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal and received oracular confirmation for the campaign. The theological framing is not decorative. It is the foundation on which the entire narrative rests. The framing Piye chose is worth stating explicitly because the entire stela is organized around it. He does not present himself as a foreign conqueror invading Egypt. He presents himself as the legitimate king of a country whose northern territories have fallen into disorder under rulers who have failed in their ritual obligations. The word he uses repeatedly for Tefnakht and his allies is not enemy in the standard Egyptian sense, but rebel, a term with specific institutional meaning, referring to a subject who has violated a legitimate order. The order Piye claims to be restoring is the order of Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of correct cosmic and political arrangement, and the authority under which he claims to act is the authority of Amun, delivered through the oracle at Jebel Barkal. The military narrative proceeds through a series of engagements at named cities. The Kushite advance force met Tefnakht's coalition in the region of Heracleopolis and, according to the stela, drove it back. Piye's main army then moved north, taking Hermopolis after a siege that the text describes in considerable detail. The Hermopolis siege occupies a substantial portion of the stela, not because it was militarily the most difficult engagement, but because it allowed Piye to construct a specific kind of scene. When Nimlot surrendered, he sent out his wife and daughters to plead for mercy from Piye's queens and princesses. Piye entered the city, inspected the royal stables, and discovered that Nimlot's horses had been starved during the siege. The stela records Piye's reaction in direct speech. He declares that the mistreatment of the horses is a graver offense than any of Nimlot's political crimes. This passage is one of the most quoted sections of the entire Kushite corpus, and it is doing specific ideological work. It presents Piye as a ruler whose sense of ma'at extends to the treatment of animals and whose judgment operates at a level of moral seriousness that his opponents do not reach. After Hermopolis, the campaign moved north to Memphis. The Memphis engagement is described in the stela as the decisive military event of the campaign. Tefnakht had reinforced the city, but Piye's forces took it in a single assault, entering through the harbor after the Nile flood had raised the water level high enough to bring boats against the city walls. The stela describes the taking of Memphis in language that emphasizes both military effectiveness and ritual correctness. Piye's first act after entering the city was to proceed to the temple of Ptah, make offerings, and be recognized in the ancient royal titulary of Memphite kingship. The military event and the ritual event are not narrated as separate. They are narrated as a single sequence. From Memphis, Piye received the submission of the Delta rulers. The stela lists them by name and title, including Osorkon, the fourth of Tanis, Ayuput, the second of Leontopolis, and the various great chiefs of the Ma. Each is described as coming forward to make obeisance, to present tribute, and to swear loyalty. The stela distinguishes carefully between those Delta rulers who submitted formally and were received by Piye, and those who were not received. Tefnacht himself did not appear in person. He sent messengers, sent tribute, and swore an oath transmitted through intermediaries. Piye accepted this arrangement without pressing further. The text presents this acceptance as a magnanimous decision. It also had the practical consequence of leaving Tefnacht in place at Sais, a decision whose consequences would unfold over the following decades. One further feature of the stela deserves attention. Piye did not enter the palaces of the submitted Delta rulers, and he did not admit most of them into his own presence. The text explains this in ritual terms. The Delta rulers were uncircumcised and ate fish, which rendered them ritually incompatible with the Kushite royal space. Only Nimlot of Hermopolis, who had been ritually purified, was admitted. This detail is significant on multiple levels. It marks the boundary Piye maintained between his person and the northern rulers, even as he accepted their submissions. It also indicates that the Napatan court operated with ritual purity standards that were more restrictive than those of the Delta houses, and that Piye chose to make those standards visible as part of the campaign's public meaning. The decision to return south rather than remain in Egypt shaped everything that followed for nearly 2 decades. Piye's departure left the country in a condition that was, in formal terms, unified under a single overlord and, in practical terms, running along the same distributed lines it had run along before the campaign. The submitted rulers remained in their cities. The Delta houses retained their territorial holdings. Thebes continued under the management of the Amun priesthood and the office of the god's wife. What had changed was the acknowledgement, inscribed now in oaths and in the tribute presented at Memphis, that all of these authorities operated under the sovereignty of the Kushite king at Napata. The change was real. It was also, for the moment, primarily symbolic. Piye himself did not return to Egypt after the campaign. He continued to rule from Napata until his death, which is dated approximately to 714 BC, and he was buried at El Kuru in a tomb whose superstructure took the form of a small pyramid, the first known pyramid burial of a Kushite king. The El Kuru pyramid was modest in scale by comparison with the great pyramids of the Old Kingdom, standing perhaps 8 meters at its original height, but it marked a decisive shift in Kushite royal practice. The rulers who followed Piye would all be buried under pyramids, first at El Kuru and later at Nuri, and the practice would continue in Kushite royal cemeteries for the next 1,000 years. The adoption of the pyramid form is one of the clearest indications that the Napatan court had come to understand its own kingship as continuous with the deep Egyptian tradition, not merely as adjacent to it. Piye was succeeded by his brother Shabaka, whose accession is dated to approximately 714 BC. Shabaka made a different decision about the north. Rather than governing Egypt as an overlord from Napata, he moved his royal seat to Memphis and administered the country directly. This shift is documented archaeologically by a substantial building program at Memphis and Thebes carried out under Shabaka's name, and it is documented textually by a change in the pattern of royal inscriptions, which begin to appear in Egyptian temples across the country, in numbers that indicate a resident royal presence rather than a distant overlordship. The most famous document associated with Shabaka's Memphite reign is the object now called the Shabaka stone, a rectangular slab of basalt inscribed with a theological text describing the creation of the world by Ptah. The stone's opening lines state that Shabaka had the text copied from a worm-eaten papyrus he found in the temple of Ptah, a claim that presents his reign as an act of textual restoration. Under Shabaka, the character of Kushite rule in Egypt took a form that would persist through the reigns of his successors Shebitku and Taharqa. The Kushite king was resident in Egypt and functioned as the pharaoh in all the standard ceremonial and administrative senses. The Delta rulers who had submitted to Piye remained in place but now operated under closer supervision, with Kushite officials stationed at key points along the river. Memphis functioned as the northern administrative center. Thebes functioned as the ceremonial center of Upper Egypt, its position reinforced by the continued Kushite investment in the God's Wife institution. Napata remained the religious heartland of the dynasty and the site to which Kushite kings returned for coronation, for major festivals, and for burial. The iconography of Kushite kingship in Egypt developed a distinctive signature during this period. The most immediately recognizable element is the double uraeus, the twin cobras worn on the royal brow. Egyptian pharaonic tradition had used a single uraeus, representing the goddess Wadjet of Lower Egypt. Kushite kings adopted a second uraeus alongside it, which their inscriptions and iconography associated with a southern counterpart. The double uraeus appears on royal statuary, on temple reliefs, and on personal seals from the reigns of Shabaka onward. It served as a visible marker that the wearer was king of two lands in a specific sense, Egypt and Kush, rather than in the older symbolic sense of Upper and Lower Egypt alone. Royal titulary developed along similar lines. Kushite kings took the full five-name pharaonic titulary in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but they also maintained their Kushite personal names in forms that remained closer to their spoken Meroitic family originals. Piye's own name in his monumental inscriptions appears in variants that reflect Kushite phonology, and his successors likewise retained personal names that marked their origin even as they adopted throne names constructed on classical Egyptian models. This dual naming practice was a form of institutional bilingualism. It communicated legitimacy in the Egyptian idiom while preserving identification in the Kushite one. Administratively, the Kushite pharaohs largely retained the Egyptian apparatus they inherited. Vizirities continued to function, temple estates continued to be managed by their existing priesthoods. The nome system, by which Egypt was divided into some 40 administrative districts, each governed by a nomarch answering to the central administration, continued to operate. What the Kushite kings added were, in most cases, overlays rather than replacements. Kushite garrisons were stationed at strategic points. Kushite officials appeared in senior positions at Memphis and Thebes. Certain temple offices were filled by Kushite appointees. The bulk of day-to-day administration, however, continued to be carried out by Egyptians in Egyptian institutions. The Delta rulers occupied a specific position within this arrangement. They retained their local authority, their titles, and their revenues. They contributed troops when the central government required them, and remitted a share of their revenues as tribute. They were not deposed. Osorkon IV of Tanis, Euput II of Leontopolis, and their successors continued to govern their cities. The chieftains of the Ma at Mendes, Sebenitos, and other delta centers likewise continued in place. This arrangement gave the Kushite pharaohs relatively low administrative costs in the north, but preserved the underlying structure of delta autonomy that had produced Tefnacht's coalition in the first place. The submitted houses remained in place, and so did the political architecture that could, under different conditions, produce a similar coalition again. If the exercise of overlordship transformed how Egypt was governed under the 25th dynasty, it also transformed the kingdom that supplied the overlords. The changes that unfolded in Kush across the decades of Piye, Shabaka, Shebitku, and Taharqa are visible in the archaeological record of Napata, Kawa, El Kuru, and Nuri, and in the corpus of Kushite royal inscriptions preserved on stone stelae, temple walls, and statuary. These changes were not a matter of Kush becoming Egyptian, they were a matter of Kush becoming a more elaborated version of what it had already been, drawing on the material and institutional resources that access to Egypt made newly available. The most visible material change was in royal burial practice. The pyramid form that Piye adopted at El Kuru became the standard for the dynasty and for the Napatan and Meroitic dynasties that followed. Under Shabaka, Shebitku, and Taharqa, the pyramids at El Kuru and Nuri grew larger and more architecturally sophisticated. Taharqa's own pyramid at Nuri, constructed in the 7th century BC, reached a height of approximately 50 meters at its original size, and remains the largest pyramid ever built in Nubia. The interior chambers of these pyramids were cut into the bedrock beneath the superstructures, and included multiple rooms decorated with texts drawn from the Egyptian mortuary corpus, the pyramid texts, the Book of the Dead, and passages from the Amduat. Kushite kings, in other words, were being buried with the full apparatus of Egyptian afterlife literature, adapted for their tombs by scribes trained in the Egyptian tradition. The adaptation was not slavish. Kushite pyramids retained proportions that distinguished them from their Egyptian predecessors: steeper sides, narrower bases, taller in relation to their footprint. The mortuary chapels attached to their eastern faces followed a Nubian pattern rather than an Egyptian one. Certain grave goods, particularly the beds on which the dead were laid, reflected Nubian rather than Egyptian tradition. What the Kushite kings were doing was selective incorporation. They were assembling a mortuary program that spoke in both institutional languages simultaneously, marking their kingship as legitimate within the Egyptian religious framework, while retaining features that identified them as Kushite. Temple construction underwent a comparable expansion. The Amun temple at Jebel Barkal, which had existed in some form since the New Kingdom occupation, was substantially enlarged and rebuilt under the 25th dynasty kings. Taharqa, in particular, carried out extensive works at the site, adding a hypostyle hall, a colonnaded court, and outlying sanctuaries. The rock-cut chapels along the base of the mountain, dedicated to Mut, Hathor, and Amun in his ram-headed Nubian form, date substantially to this period. The scale of the Jebel Barkal complex under Taharqa approached that of major Egyptian temple centers, and its architectural vocabulary was drawn directly from contemporary Egyptian temple practice. The temple at Kawa, downstream of Napata, received particularly heavy investment under Taharqa. Kawa had existed as a religious site since earlier periods, but under Taharqa's patronage it was rebuilt on a monumental scale. The Kawa temple complex included a stone-built temple to Amun, subsidiary shrines, workshop areas, and a residential quarter for temple personnel. The site is also the source of some of the most historically valuable inscriptions from the 25th dynasty. The Kawa Stelae, a series of stone monuments erected by Taharqa in the temple, record his building activities, his religious dedications, and, in one particularly detailed inscription, his observations on the Nile flood in the 6th year of his reign, a flood that his text describes as unusually high and as covering the fields with silt in a quantity that guaranteed abundant harvests. The Kawa flood inscription is one of the earliest surviving Egyptian language texts to describe hydrological observation as a matter of royal concern in explicit terms. Kushite scribal culture underwent a corresponding expansion. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, which had been in use in Kushite royal contexts before Piye's campaign, now became the standard script for royal inscriptions across the kingdom. The scribes who produced these inscriptions were trained in Egyptian conventions of grammar, formulae, and orthography, and the texts they produced are, in linguistic terms, contemporary Egyptian rather than a Kushite variant. This required either the training of Kushite scribes in Egyptian centers or the recruitment of Egyptian scribes to work in Kushite ones, and probably both. The result was a Kushite scribal apparatus capable of producing texts indistinguishable in language from those produced at Karnak, applied to the recording of specifically Kushite royal acts. Alongside the elite adoption of Egyptian scribal practice, however, spoken language in Kush remained Kushite. The language recorded later in the Meroitic inscriptions of the following centuries was not Egyptian, but a distinct language of a family whose exact affiliations are still debated. What the 25th dynasty period represents in linguistic terms is a bilingual elite operating within a broader population that spoke a different language, using Egyptian as the language of monumental record and administration, while retaining Kushite as the language of daily life. This is a common pattern in ancient states that adopted a prestige script from a neighbor, and it produced a situation in which the written record of Kush during this period is disproportionately Egyptian in character, while the underlying social reality was not. The Kushite court also incorporated elements of Egyptian religious practice beyond the Amun cult that had already been shared. The cults of Ptah, Osiris, Isis, and Bastet appear in Kushite royal inscriptions from this period, sometimes in dedications from Kushite kings to Egyptian temples, and sometimes in the installation of these cults at Kushite sites. The Kawa temple included chapels to multiple Egyptian deities alongside its Amun sanctuary. The El Koro and Nuri pyramid chapels contained offering formulae addressed to Osiris in the standard Egyptian mortuary language. This religious incorporation was not syncretism in the sense of blending Kushite and Egyptian deities into new hybrid forms. It was expansion of the Kushite pantheon to include Egyptian gods as themselves, worshipped in their Egyptian forms in Kushite spaces. Material culture in Kush during this period shows a comparable pattern of selective incorporation. Ceramic assemblages from Napatan sites include both Egyptian form vessels and Nubian form vessels in significant numbers, often in the same contexts. Metalwork shows Egyptian techniques applied to objects in both Egyptian and Nubian traditions. Textiles, so far as they survive, reflect a similar mixed pattern. The Kushite elite was not replacing its material world with an Egyptian one. It was accumulating a broader material vocabulary drawn from both traditions and using elements from each as circumstances required. The transformations that unfolded in Kush during these decades had a parallel on the northern side of the relationship, though the parallel is not symmetrical. Egypt did not become more Kushite in the way that Kush became more Egyptian in certain registers. What Egypt experienced under 25th dynasty rule was a redirection of resources, a shift in the balance among its own regions, and a particular kind of cultural program that the Kushite pharaohs pursued deliberately and that left visible marks on the country's institutions and monuments. The most consequential of these changes was the elevation of Thebes. Thebes had been the religious center of Egypt for centuries, but its political weight had waned during the Third Intermediate Period as royal authority moved north to the Delta and as the city itself came under the effective management of its Amun priesthood rather than a resident king. The 25th dynasty reversed this drift. Kushite kings poured resources into Thebes, restored and expanded its temples, and made the Amun cult at Karnak the theological anchor of their regime. The city that had been drifting toward the status of a wealthy ecclesiastical enclave now became again a central node of Egyptian political life. The building program at Karnak under the Kushite pharaohs was substantial. Shabaka added a colonnade in the temple's outer court. Taharqa constructed a monumental kiosk in the first court, a structure whose single surviving column still stands and marks the scale of what he attempted. Taharqa also carried out works at the Karnak Sacred Lake, the Temple of Mut immediately south of the main precinct, and the Temple of Montu to the north. These were not gestures of piety alone. They were the material infrastructure of a regime that had chosen to locate itself, ideologically, at Karnak. The office of the god's wife of Amun reached its institutional peak during this period. Amenirtis I, Piye's sister, held the office through most of the reigns of Shabaka and Shebitku. She was succeeded by Shepenwepet II, Piye's daughter, who held the office through the reign of Taharqa and into the following period. The estates attached to the god's wife office grew to include substantial agricultural land in Upper Egypt, workshops, and dependent personnel. The office functioned as a parallel administrative structure to the Amun temple itself, with its own steward, its own treasury, and its own building program. The mortuary chapels of the god's wives at Medinet Habu, constructed on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Thebes, are among the most refined examples of small-scale sacred architecture produced in Egypt during this period. The senior civil administrator of Upper Egypt during much of this period was Montuemhat, the fourth prophet of Amun, and mayor of Thebes. Montuemhat had held office before the Kushite pharaohs took direct control of Egypt and continued in office through the reigns of Taharqa and into the following period. His tomb at El Asasif, on the west bank of Thebes, one of the largest non-royal tombs of the era, contains biographical inscriptions, in which he describes his administrative responsibilities in detail. The inscriptions record his oversight of temple restorations, his management of grain supplies during periods of scarcity, and his construction of chapels in the Karnak precinct. What they demonstrate is the extent to which the Kushite pharaohs governed Upper Egypt in cooperation with existing Egyptian elite institutions rather than through a Kushite administrative overlay. Montuemhat was not a Kushite official. He was an Egyptian who continued in office because the Kushite regime chose to work with him. The artistic program of the 25th dynasty is one of the most studied aspects of the period. Kushite-sponsored sculpture, relief, and small-scale art displays a distinctive style that combines contemporary compositional conventions with an intentional return to models drawn from the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years earlier. Royal statuary of Shabaka, Shebitku, and Taharqa uses proportions, musculature, and facial modeling that reference specific earlier traditions. Private statuary produced under the dynasty likewise draws on archaic models, with certain nobles depicted in seated cross-legged scribal poses that had been standard in the Old Kingdom but had fallen out of use in the intervening centuries. This program is now generally described in the scholarly literature as the Kushite archaism. The archaizing program was not indiscriminate imitation. It was a selective invocation of the periods of Egyptian history most strongly associated with unified rule and pyramid building. The Kushite pharaohs, whose own tombs were pyramids, were making a specific claim about their kingship by aligning its visual vocabulary with the great pyramid building periods of the Egyptian past. The claim was that 25th dynasty rule was continuous with the deepest and most legitimate strata of Egyptian tradition, not a foreign superimposition on it. Egyptian sculptors, scribes, and priests were the ones who executed this program, and they did so with a level of technical accomplishment that indicates active engagement rather than mechanical compliance. Temple restoration extended beyond Karnak. The 25th dynasty carried out works at Memphis, at Abydos, at Edfu, at Elephantine, and at multiple smaller sites. Some of this activity was reconstruction of structures that had deteriorated during the fragmented periods before Kushite rule. Some of it was expansion of existing complexes. What connects the works across sites is a consistent pattern of investment in traditional Egyptian religious infrastructure. The Kushite regime spent its Egyptian revenues significantly on the temples of the country it governed, and the temples in question were Egyptian temples of Egyptian gods, executed in Egyptian style. The Delta experienced a different set of changes. Direct royal building activity in the Delta was more limited during the 25th dynasty than in the south. This is partly a matter of preservation, since Delta sites have suffered more severe archaeological loss than sites in Upper Egypt, but the pattern also reflects a Kushite prioritization of Upper Egyptian projects. What the Delta rulers themselves did during this period was more heterogeneous. Some Delta houses continued to sponsor temple works in their own cities on a reduced scale. Others appear to have redirected resources into consolidating their local positions. The autonomous administrative structures of the Delta houses remained functional, and their revenues remained largely under their own control, subject to the tribute obligations owed to the Kushite pharaoh. Delta resentment of Kushite rule is not documented in any surviving Delta inscription in explicit terms. What can be traced is a pattern of Delta political activity during and after the 25th dynasty that suggests continuous local ambition rather than settled acceptance. The House of Sais, in particular, retained its position through the interruption caused by Bakenrinef's fall and re-emerged in the following decades. Delta houses maintained their military capacities, they maintained their diplomatic contacts with Levantine states, they maintained the infrastructure of an alternative political center that could, if circumstances changed, function as a rival to the Kushite regime. The reign that brought the dual kingdom to its widest extent began in approximately 690 BC, when Taharqa succeeded his cousin Shebitku. Taharqa was a son of Piye and a nephew of Shabaka, and he had served under Shebitku as a senior military commander before his accession. He was, by his own account, and by the reckoning of the sources that describe him from outside, a ruler who understood both the ceremonial and the practical dimensions of his office with unusual clarity. His reign lasted approximately 26 years and produced a body of monumental evidence larger than that of any other 25th dynasty king. The territorial reach of the state Taharqa inherited extended from the region above the Sixth Cataract in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north. Within this span, he functioned as pharaoh in the full Egyptian sense and as king of Kush in the full Napatan sense simultaneously. The two roles were not held in tension. They were understood, within the ideological framework the dynasty had developed, as a single office exercised across two geographically distinct halves of a unified realm. Taharqa's inscriptions describe him consistently in this dual register, using the standard Egyptian pharaonic titulary alongside epithets that identified him as the son of Amun of Napata and the ruler of the southern lands. Taharqa's building program was the largest carried out by any king of the dynasty and one of the largest carried out by any Egyptian ruler of the first millennium BC. In addition to the works at Karnak and Kawa already noted, his name appears on structures at Medinet Habu, at Sanam near Napata, at Semna and Buhen in Lower Nubia, and at multiple smaller Delta and Middle Egyptian sites. The Sanam Temple, dedicated to Amun and located directly across the river from Jebel Barkal, was constructed on a scale that approached the Mother Sanctuary itself. The Semna and Buhen works reinforced the New Kingdom fortifications along the Second Cataract, which Taharqa restored and pressed back into service as functional installations rather than symbolic ones. The distribution of these works indicates that Taharqa was investing in infrastructure across the full length of the realm, rather than concentrating on any single center. The Kawa stelae, which have already been noted for the flood inscription of the 6th regnal year, contain other historically important passages. One of them records Taharqa's accession and his journey from Nubia to Memphis to be crowned. Another describes his dispatch of craftsmen and materials from Egypt to Kawa for the temple's construction, specifying that the labor force included Egyptian artisans working under Kushite direction. A third records the establishment of endowments to support the temple's operations in perpetuity, including grants of land, cattle, and dependent personnel. Taken together, the Kawa inscriptions document the operational mechanics by which the dual kingdom moved resources and expertise between its halves. Taharqa's diplomatic activity extended well beyond the borders of the realm itself. Egyptian sources and, more importantly, external sources from the Levant document Kushite involvement in the politics of the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Phoenician cities, Philistine principalities, and the small kingdoms of the southern Levant, including Judah under Hezekiah, received Kushite envoys and, at moments of crisis, Kushite military support. The most extensively documented episode is the involvement of a Kushite force in the Levantine campaign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 701 BC. The biblical account in the second book of Kings and in Isaiah refers to a king called Taharqa, whose name is generally identified with Taharqa, arriving at the head of a force to support the coalition against Sennacherib. The chronology of this identification has been disputed, since Taharqa's own accession is dated later than 701 BC, and the current scholarly consensus is that Taharqa was present in 701 BC as a senior commander under Shebitku, rather than as king in his own right. What is not disputed is that Kushite forces were involved in the Levantine campaign, and that the Kushite regime had adopted a foreign policy of active engagement in the region. The engagement had a specific strategic logic. The states of the Levant sat between Egypt and Assyria, and their alignment determined whether Assyrian power would reach the Egyptian frontier directly or would be held at a distance by intervening buffer states. Kushite support for anti-Assyrian coalitions in the Levant aimed to keep those buffer states functioning. This was not an idealistic policy. It was a calculation about where the Kushite regime preferred to fight the Assyrians, if fighting became necessary, and the answer the calculation produced was as far from the Egyptian border as possible. The material record of Taharqa's reign shows a regime that had reached a point of confident equilibrium. Coinage did not yet exist in this region during this period, but the standardized weights, sealed commodity containers, and administrative documents of Taharqa's reign indicate a working system of long-distance exchange under royal management. The temple archives, insofar as they can be reconstructed from surviving fragments, describe a fiscal apparatus that collected revenues from Egyptian and Nubian sources in parallel and redistributed them through royal and temple channels. The dual kingdom was not merely a political fiction. It was a functioning administrative reality with its own procedures for moving grain, gold, cattle, and manufactured goods across the length of the Nile. The Theban establishment during Taharqa's reign continued under the joint management of Montuemhat and Shepenwepet II. Taharqa's relationship with both figures appears from the surviving inscriptions to have been cooperative rather than supervisory. Montuemhat carried out major building projects at Karnak under his own name during Taharqa's reign, and Shepenwepet II's mortuary chapel at Medinet Habu was constructed during this period with the resources of her office. The distribution of monumental output between the king and these senior officials indicates a distributed system of patronage in which multiple parties invested simultaneously in the theological and material infrastructure of the regime. The direction from which pressure would arrive lay across the Sinai and the Levantine coast, in a state whose trajectory across the 8th century BC had been as consequential for the ancient Near East as the Kushite expansion had been for the Nile Valley. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, centered on the cities of Nineveh, Kalhu, and Ashur in the upper Tigris region, had by the beginning of the 7th century BC extended its authority over most of Mesopotamia, the Zagros foothills, eastern Anatolia, and the Levantine coast as far south as the Egyptian frontier. Its rulers had built an administrative apparatus and a military establishment of a scale unprecedented in the region, and by the reign of Sennacherib in the late 8th century BC, its western campaigns had begun to press directly against the buffer zone that separated it from Kushite-ruled Egypt. Assyria's rise had proceeded through a series of dynastic reigns, whose consolidation of imperial structure is documented in the royal annals inscribed on stone slabs, clay prisms, and palace reliefs preserved in substantial quantities. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from approximately 745 to 727 BC, reorganized the empire's provincial administration and standardized the practice of mass deportation of subject populations from rebellious regions to distant parts of the empire. His successors Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib extended these methods across an expanding territorial base. By the reign of Sennacherib, from approximately 705 to 681 BC, the empire had absorbed the northern Israelite kingdom, reduced the southern kingdom of Judah to tributary status, and established a permanent Assyrian presence in the Phoenician and Philistine cities of the coast. The technological and organizational features of the Assyrian military establishment during this period gave it capacities that no other regional power possessed at comparable scale. Iron weaponry, which had entered general use in the Near East during the earlier 1st millennium BC, was produced in Assyrian workshops in quantities that equipped standing armies of tens of thousands. Siege equipment, battering rams, siege towers, and undermining teams was developed to a level of sophistication that made Assyrian campaigns against fortified cities routinely successful. The army itself was organized around a permanent professional corps supplemented by provincial levies, with a system of logistical supply that allowed sustained operations at considerable distances from the imperial center. Assyrian cavalry, drawing on horse-breeding traditions in the northeastern provinces, operated in coordination with infantry and archer units, in tactical combinations that written sources and reliefs document in detail. Assyrian awareness of Kushite Egypt developed gradually across the reigns of Sargon II and Sennacherib. Sargon's inscriptions mention Egypt in the context of Levantine campaigns and describe the Egyptian frontier as the western limit of the region within which Assyrian arms operated. Sennacherib's campaign of 701 BC, which included the confrontation at El Teke with a coalition force that involved Kushite units, produced the first extended Assyrian textual engagement with Kushite Egypt as a political actor. Sennacherib's annals describe the Kushites in terms that acknowledge their military capacity without treating them as a peer power. The Assyrian conceptual framework at this stage placed Kushite Egypt in the category of distant kingdoms whose ambitions in the Levant required checking, but whose home territory lay beyond the range of routine Assyrian operations. The framework began to change during the reign of Esarhaddon, son of Sennacherib, who ruled from 681 to 669 BC. Esarhaddon's inscriptions record a shift in Assyrian policy toward Egypt from containment at the Levantine frontier to direct engagement. The shift was driven partly by continued Kushite support for anti-Assyrian activity in the Levant, which Esarhaddon's texts describe as a persistent obstacle to the stabilization of Assyrian authority in the region, and partly by the strategic logic that as long as an independent Kushite-ruled Egypt existed, no settlement in the Levant would be permanent. Esarhaddon's early campaigns focused on securing the Sinai approach and establishing supply arrangements with Arab tribal groups whose territories controlled the desert crossings. The Assyrian textual record on Kush during this period is worth examining in some detail, because it represents the second major body of contemporary evidence for the 25th dynasty alongside the Kushite royal inscriptions themselves. Esarhaddon's annals refer to Taharqa by name, using the Akkadian rendering Tark, and describe him as king of Kush and Egypt. The texts describe Kushite forces as numerous, as equipped with chariots and cavalry, and as capable of holding fortified positions. What the Assyrian texts do not describe in detail is the internal organization of the Kushite regime or its administrative apparatus. From the Assyrian perspective, what mattered was military capacity and territorial reach. Political structure was significant only insofar as it affected these operational realities. The Assyrian reliefs from the palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which post-date the events of Esarhaddon's reign but depict some of them, include representations of Kushite soldiers, prisoners, and tribute bearers. These reliefs show individuals with facial features and hairstyles that the Assyrian sculptors intended as ethnographically specific. They depict clothing, weapons, and personal ornaments in ways that suggest either direct observation or access to informants with such observation. The reliefs also include representations of Egyptian and Kushite architecture in stylized but recognizable form, indicating that the Assyrian court had accumulated visual information about the enemy country in some depth. The plan that had been developing for a decade was executed in the spring and early summer of 671 BC. Esarhaddon led the invasion in person, moving his army across the Sinai along the route the Assyrian preparations had secured. His annals record the crossing in detail, describing the arrangement of water supplies through cooperation with Arab tribal groups, whose camels carried water skins along the desert stages of the march. The logistical preparation had been the constraint on any previous Assyrian move against Egypt, and its resolution was what made the campaign of 671 BC possible. Once the army reached the eastern edge of the delta, the geographical obstacle that had protected the Egyptian frontier for generations had been overcome. Taharqa had received warning of the invasion and had moved forces to the delta to meet it. The Assyrian annals describe 3 engagements fought over the course of 15 days, all of them Assyrian victories. The specific locations of these engagements are not identifiable with certainty from the surviving texts, but the sequence indicates a fighting withdrawal by the Kushite forces from the eastern delta toward Memphis. The Kushite defense was neither collapse nor rout. It was a series of contested engagements in which the Assyrian army's superior numbers, equipment, and operational coordination proved decisive at each stage. Taharqa himself was reportedly wounded in one of these engagements. According to a passage in the Esarhaddon Annals, whose reading has been debated, but whose general import, that the Kushite king had personally led resistance and had personally suffered in it, is not seriously disputed. Memphis fell to the Assyrian army after the final of these engagements. Esarhaddon's annals describe the capture of the city in the standard vocabulary Assyrian royal texts used for such events. The walls were breached, the palace was entered, the treasury was taken. The specific detail that distinguishes the Memphis capture from other Assyrian city captures in the annals is the taking of Taharqa's family. Esarhaddon's text records the capture of a queen, of royal princes and princesses, and of members of the extended royal household, along with the movable treasury of the Kushite regime at Memphis. These captives were transported to Assyria and appear in later Assyrian records as figures held at the imperial center. Taharqa himself escaped south, withdrawing up the Nile with the remnant of his field army toward Thebes and beyond. The material captured at Memphis was substantial. Esarhaddon's inscriptions itemize gold, silver, precious stones, ivory, horses, cattle, and craftsmen, along with the physical apparatus of the Kushite court that had been resident at Memphis. Some of this material was carried back to Assyria as tribute, some was distributed to the Delta rulers who had submitted to Esarhaddon, some was retained at Memphis for the administration Esarhaddon now established there. The scale of the capture indicates that the Kushite regime had maintained a significant material presence at Memphis and had not been able to evacuate it before the city fell. The political settlement Esarhaddon imposed on Egypt was distinctive in its structure. Rather than annexing the country and administering it directly through Assyrian officials, Esarhaddon appointed Egyptian rulers as vassals in each of the significant delta cities and confirmed them in their positions under Assyrian overlordship. The list of these appointments, preserved in the Esarhaddon Prism, names 20 vassal rulers across the Delta and Middle Egypt. Several of them are recognizable as members of the Libyan descended houses that had governed these cities under the 25th dynasty. Others were new appointments drawn from local elite families. The most significant of these appointments was the confirmation of Necho I of Sais, a descendant of the earlier Tefnacht line, as ruler of Sais and Memphis. Necho's position was, in the Assyrian framework, the senior among the Delta vassals, and it gave the Saite house a formal recognition it had not previously held under Kushite rule. Alongside these vassal rulers, Esarhaddon stationed Assyrian garrisons at strategic points, including Memphis itself, and installed Assyrian officials as supervisors of the vassal administration. The arrangement was designed to hold Egypt at low cost. The local rulers would carry the burden of day-to-day administration, while the Assyrian presence would enforce the overall settlement. Whether this arrangement would prove durable depended on two variables that Esarhaddon's settlement could not fully control. The first was whether the vassal rulers would remain loyal in the absence of continuous Assyrian pressure. The second was whether Taharqa, still at large in the south, would attempt to reverse the settlement once Assyrian forces withdrew from Egypt. The contest that carried into Ashurbanipal's reign is the point at which the mechanics of the wider shift become legible, and the mechanics are worth pausing over before the narrative resumes. What had happened at Memphis in 671 BC, and what would happen in the years that followed, cannot be explained by any single cause acting alone. Three causes were operating simultaneously, each reinforcing the others, and it is the interaction among them, rather than the operation of any one of them, that produced the outcome. The Assyrian invasion is the most visible of the three, but its effects were amplified by two other factors, whose independent existence predated the invasion and whose combination with it turned a military reverse into a structural one. The first of these was Assyrian material and organizational superiority in the specific form of conflict that had been engaged. The Assyrian army that Esarhaddon led into Egypt operated with iron weaponry produced at industrial scale, siege equipment designed for the reduction of fortified cities, and a logistical apparatus capable of sustaining operations across the Sinai. The Kushite army, by contrast, drew on a military tradition that emphasized cavalry, archery, and mobile infantry, effective in the kinds of engagement that had characterized its earlier campaigns, but not optimally configured for the sustained defense of major fortified positions against a besieging force with the resources the Assyrians deployed. This was not a matter of Kushite backwardness. It was a matter of the two military systems having been developed under different conditions and for different primary purposes. When they came into direct contact under conditions that favored the Assyrian system, the result was predictable in structural terms, even if it was not predetermined in specific ones. The second factor was the internal political realignment within Egypt itself, particularly in the Delta. The 25th dynasty had governed the Delta through the arrangement already described. The submitted local rulers had been retained in place, granted continued authority over their cities, and made responsible for tribute and military contributions. This arrangement had produced 2 decades of stability under Kushite ascendancy, but it had also preserved the political architecture within which alternative alignments could be assembled. The Saite house in particular had never lost its institutional position, its territorial base, or its network of connections to other Delta houses. When the Assyrian invasion offered an alternative overlord, the Delta rulers had the organizational capacity to shift alignment without requiring the reconstitution of political structures that had been suppressed. They shifted because the structures were still there to shift. Necho I of Sais, whom Esarhaddon had appointed to the senior vassal position, is the specific figure in whom this realignment concentrated. His shift toward Assyria was not a betrayal in any dramatic sense. It was the resumption, under different external conditions, of the trajectory the Saite house had been on since Tefnacht, the pursuit of a consolidated authority in the Delta, and, from that base, a broader claim on Egypt. Kushite overlordship had checked this trajectory for 2 decades. Assyrian overlordship, offered on terms that recognized rather than suppressed the Saite position, provided a framework within which the trajectory could be resumed. The Saite realignment was thus not a cause introduced by the Assyrian invasion. It was a pre-existing pattern of political ambition that the invasion made operational. The third factor was the structural cost of governing Egypt from Napata. The 25th dynasty had established a system in which the royal center was located in Kush, while the primary administrative burden lay in Egypt, particularly at Memphis. The system had functioned for several decades because no sustained external pressure had required either half to defend itself with resources drawn from the other half. The Assyrian invasion changed this. The defense of Egypt required the concentration of forces at points in the Delta, which required moving resources from Kush over a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers along the Nile. When those forces were defeated, the Kushite regime had the option of withdrawing to Kush and preserving its southern base, and this is what it did. But withdrawal was itself a form of structural cost. It meant that the regime's presence in Egypt depended on cycles of reassertion, each of which required the mobilization of resources from a distant center. The Assyrians, by contrast, operated from imperial bases that were closer to Egypt than Napata was, and that were connected to Egypt through routes across the Sinai and along the coast. The geography of the contest structurally favored the party operating from the east over the party operating from the far south. These three factors interlocked in specific ways. Assyrian military capacity was what made the initial invasion successful. Delta realignment was what made the Assyrian settlement viable after Esarhaddon's withdrawal, because it provided the local governing partners without whom Assyria could not have held Egypt at manageable cost. Kushite's structural overextension was what made each Kushite reassertion, however successful in the short term, unsustainable in the medium term, because it required continuous exertion against a system whose geographical advantages did not diminish. Each factor amplified the others. Assyrian military success made Delta realignment more attractive to the Delta rulers. Because the Assyrians appeared to be the winning side, Delta realignment made Kushite reassertion more difficult, because it deprived the Kushite regime of the local partners it had relied on. Kushite structural overextension made each reassertion more costly, which in turn made the regime's position in Egypt more precarious with each cycle. The next stage of the contest opened under new leadership on both sides. Taharqa died in approximately 664 BC and was buried at Nuri under the largest of the Kushite royal pyramids. His successor was his nephew Tanutumun, the son of Shabaka's daughter, whose accession was recognized at Napata according to the standard Kushite coronation ceremonies at Jebel Barkal. On the Assyrian side, Ashurbanipal had by this point consolidated his position at Nineveh, and had turned his attention to the unresolved Egyptian situation his father had left him. The two young rulers inherited a contest whose earlier phase had established the terms, but had not settled the outcome. Tanutumun's approach to the Egyptian question is documented in one of the most remarkable surviving Kushite royal inscriptions, the stela now known as the Dream Stela, erected at Jebel Barkal shortly after his accession. The stela opens with an account of a dream in which Tanutumun saw two serpents, one on his right and one on his left. The interpretation given in the text is that the serpents represented Upper and Lower Egypt, and that the dream signified the god's authorization for Tanutumun to take possession of both lands. The theological framing is consistent with the earlier Kushite pattern of grounding political action in oracular authority. What follows in the stela is a detailed narrative of the campaign Tanutumun launched on the strength of the dream. The campaign moved north from Napata along the Nile in approximately 664 or 663 BC. According to the Dream Stela, Tanutumun's forces reached Thebes, were received there by the Amun priesthood, and continued north to Memphis. At Memphis, Tanutumun encountered a force led by Necho I of Sais, whom the Assyrians had established as the senior vassal ruler. The Dream Stela describes an engagement in which Necho's forces were defeated and Necho himself was killed. The city of Memphis was taken by the Kushite army, and Tanutumun proceeded north into the Delta to receive submissions from the Delta rulers who had aligned themselves with Assyria. Several of these rulers came forward and submitted. Others withdrew into their fortified cities and refused to submit. The stela records the tribute presented to Tanutumun at Memphis and describes his subsequent return south for religious observances. The Kushite reoccupation of Egypt in 664 or 663 BC was, at the moment the Dream Stela was inscribed, the reversal of the Assyrian settlement of 671 BC. What the stela describes is not incorrect, but what it does not describe is what happened next. Ashurbanipal's response to the news of the reoccupation was to launch a full campaign of his own against Egypt, drawing on the substantial military resources the empire had continued to develop since Esarhaddon's earlier expedition. The Assyrian campaign of 663 BC is described in Ashurbanipal's own annals, preserved on clay prisms recovered from the palace at Nineveh. The Assyrian army moved through the Sinai along the route Esarhaddon had used, entered the Delta, and engaged Kushite forces at several points. Tanutumun withdrew south rather than attempting to hold Memphis. The Assyrian army followed him along the Nile, taking each major center as it advanced. The campaign continued past Memphis, past the middle stretch of the river, and reached Thebes itself. Thebes had not been attacked by a foreign army in any comparable manner in living memory. Its temples, treasuries, and administrative apparatus were concentrated in a single urban complex that had grown up around the sanctuary of Amun at Karnak. The Assyrian sack of the city, which Ashurbanipal's annals describe in detail, was thorough. The Karnak precinct was entered, the treasury of the temple was taken, objects of gold, silver, precious stones, and imported hardwoods were removed and transported to Assyria. 2 obelisks of Electrum were carried away. The city itself was not destroyed in the sense of being razed, but its movable wealth was systematically stripped, and its population subjected to the standard Assyrian treatment of captured centers, which included deportations and the imposition of tribute. The impact of the sack extended beyond the immediate material loss. Thebes had functioned throughout the 25th dynasty as the ideological heart of the regime's Egyptian half, the site through which Kushite legitimacy in Egypt was sustained. Its violation demonstrated, in terms no theological framing could obscure, that the Kushite regime could not protect the institutions on which its Egyptian standing rested. The Amun priesthood, the God's wife office, and the Theban administrative apparatus survived the sack in structural terms. The offices continued, the personnel remained, the buildings were still standing, but their relationship to the Kushite regime was fundamentally changed. Thebes had been demonstrated to be insufficient as a base from which to sustain Kushite rule in Egypt. Tutankhamun himself had withdrawn to Napata before Thebes fell. The dream stela, which had been inscribed to record the campaign of 664 or 663 BC, was not updated to describe the withdrawal. What survives, in other words, is a Kushite royal document that presents only the successful phase of the sequence, with no monumental account of the reverse that followed. This asymmetry in the Kushite record is characteristic. Kushite royal inscriptions were composed as monumental self-representations rather than as narrative chronicles, and events that did not fit the framework of the self-representation were generally not inscribed. The absence of a Kushite account of the withdrawal after Thebes is therefore not evidence that the withdrawal was hidden. It is evidence that the Kushite epigraphic tradition did not include the recording of such events. The separation of the 2 spheres, once completed, opened trajectories for each that ran independently for the following centuries. What each side became after the dual kingdom ended is worth tracing in some detail, because the trajectories are not what a narrative organized around the sack of Thebes would predict. Neither Kush nor Egypt collapsed. Each continued along paths shaped by the resources and institutional forms that had been available to it before the contest and that remained available to it afterward. The Kushite state under Tutankhamun and his successors remained centered at Napata. Tutankhamun ruled at Napata for approximately a decade after the withdrawal from Egypt and was buried at El Kuru in a pyramid whose design continued the tradition established under earlier 25th dynasty kings. His successors, whose names include Atlanursa, Senkameniskin, Anlamani, and Aspelta, continued to be buried at Nuri in pyramids of comparable scale to Taharqa's, indicating that the Napatan royal apparatus retained the resources and organizational capacity to sustain elaborate mortuary construction over multiple generations. The Amun temple at Jebel Barkal remained the ideological center. The coronation ceremonies at the sanctuary continued in the forms established under earlier reigns. The scribal tradition producing Egyptian language royal inscriptions continued to operate, and the corpus of Napatan royal stelae from the 7th and 6th centuries BC is substantial. 2 developments during this later Napatan period deserve particular attention. The first is the shift of the royal burial ground from Nuri to a location further south at Meroe, near the confluence of the Nile with the Atbara River, in the 4th century BC. The shift is generally understood as marking the geographical center of gravity of the Kushite state moving southward, into a region whose agricultural conditions and access to sub-Saharan trade routes offered a different resource base than the Napata region had provided. The state that developed around Meroe over the following centuries, conventionally called the Meroitic Kingdom, retained continuity with the Napatan state in dynastic terms, in religious practice, and in the pyramid burial tradition, but it developed distinctive features of its own. The second development, related to the first, was the emergence of a Kushite script for writing the Kushite language itself. Meroitic script, which appears in inscriptions from approximately the 3rd century BC onward, was developed from Egyptian hieroglyphic and demotic forms, but was used to represent a phonological system different from Egyptian. The signs were repurposed as a syllabary or alphabetic system for the Kushite language, and the resulting script produced a body of inscriptions that documents the later Kushite state in its own linguistic terms rather than in Egyptian. The script has been substantially deciphered in phonetic terms, but the underlying language remains only partially understood, which is why the Meroitic corpus is legible in transliteration but not fully translatable in meaning. The development of the script indicates a state that had chosen to record itself in its own language rather than continuing to use Egyptian as its exclusive monumental medium. The Meroitic kingdom sustained itself for approximately 8 centuries after the shift of the royal cemetery, and its final rulers are documented into the middle of the 4th century, that is, at a date roughly 1,000 years after Piye's original campaign, in the era of the later Roman Empire. Its economy came to rest on iron production, cattle pastoralism, agriculture along the Nile and its tributaries, and long-distance trade in gold, ivory, and other high-value goods with both the Egyptian world to the north and the sub-Saharan world to the south. Its royal women, including a series of ruling queens conventionally called Candaces, exercised authority at a scale that reflected the continued centrality of the female royal line in Kushite political practice. Its temples, its pyramids, and its script remained functional until the eventual decline of the state in the 4th century, when internal shifts and external pressures, including the rise of the Aksumite kingdom in the Ethiopian highlands, ended the Meroitic state's continuity. The Egyptian trajectory took a different form. The Assyrian settlement that Ashurbanipal established after 663 BC gave the Delta rulers, and particularly the Saiti house, the platform from which they had previously been unable to consolidate the country. Necho I had been killed at Memphis by Tanudamun's forces, but his son Psamtik I survived, retained Assyrian recognition, and inherited the senior vassal position. Over the following 2 decades, as Assyrian attention shifted to other frontiers, and as Assyrian direct oversight of Egypt loosened, Psamtik I extended Saite authority over the other Delta houses, absorbed the middle stretches of the river, and eventually established control over Thebes itself. By approximately 656 BC, Psamtik had achieved a reunification of Egypt under Saite rule, and the 26th dynasty was established as the ruling house of the country. The 26th dynasty, which lasted from approximately 664 to 525 BC, is one of the more studied periods of later Egyptian history. Its rulers, Psamtik I, Necho II, Psamtik II, Apries, Ahmose II, and Psamtik III, presided over an Egyptian state that recovered a considerable degree of prosperity, engaged in significant diplomatic and military activity in the Levant and the Mediterranean, and pursued a cultural program that has been described as archaizing in its own right, drawing on models from the Old and Middle Kingdoms in ways that paralleled and in some respects extended the earlier Kushite program. The Saite period saw substantial temple construction, particularly at Sais itself and at other delta centers. It saw the settlement of Greek mercantile communities at Naucratis in the western delta. It saw Egyptian involvement in the politics of the collapsing Assyrian Empire and the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Saite trajectory ended in 525 BC when the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt and defeated Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt was absorbed into the Achaemenid Persian Empire as a satrapy and remained under Persian rule, with intervening periods of independence, for the following 2 centuries until its conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. The Egyptian state that had been reconstituted under Saite rule was thus itself absorbed by an external empire, but the absorption occurred more than a century after the withdrawal of Kushite authority and was the outcome of a different chain of events. Neither trajectory can be read as decline in the other's terms. The Kushite state continued to develop its own institutions, its own script, and its own economic base over the centuries following the withdrawal from Egypt. The Egyptian state recovered a substantial degree of political and cultural coherence under Kushite rule, before being absorbed by Persia. What ended in 663 BC was the specific configuration that had joined the two states under a single sovereignty. Each state, after that configuration ended, continued in a form recognizable as its own. Standing at the end of the trajectories, one can ask the comparative question the relationship makes possible. What did the encounter between Kush and Egypt across these roughly 90 years reveal about the resources each civilization possessed, and about the specific factors that determined how the encounter resolved? The answer lies less in the categories of military capacity or economic output than in the domain in which both civilizations had invested their deepest institutional weight, the religious and ideological infrastructure through which each conceived of legitimate rule. The Amun cult was the shared inheritance that made the encounter possible in the first place. Both civilizations organized their kingship around the god, and both accepted, in the ritual vocabulary that mattered most to them, that the god's authority could be delegated to a ruler recognized through the appropriate ceremonies. What distinguished the Kushite and Egyptian versions of this shared framework was not the theology in the abstract, but the institutional geography through which the theology was made operational. In Kush, Amun kingship was concentrated at Jebel Barkal. The oracle at the mountain, the coronation ceremonies performed there, and the royal cemeteries at El Kuru and Nuri constituted a single integrated complex within which Kushite legitimacy was produced and reproduced. The entire ideological apparatus of the state operated within a geographical radius of perhaps 30 kilometers, and its physical infrastructure was under the direct control of the royal court. In Egypt, by contrast, Amun kingship was distributed across a landscape of temples, offices, and priestly lineages that had grown up over more than 1,000 years. Karnak was the principal center, but the Amun cult was also active at Luxor, at Medinet Habu, at Kawa, at smaller sites throughout Upper Egypt, and in the form of temple estates, whose administration was carried out by officials with hereditary standing. The god's wife of Amun office at Thebes constituted a further institutional node with its own economic base. Alongside Amun, the temple economies of Ptah at Memphis, of Ra at Heliopolis, of Osiris at Abydos, and of the Delta gods at their respective centers gave Egypt an ideological infrastructure that was not centralized in any single geographic point. Egyptian legitimacy was produced by a network of religious institutions, each with its own weight and its own continuity. The consequences of this contrast played out in specific ways during the encounter. Kush was able to project its ideological framework into Egypt through the Amun network with unusual speed because the network was already there and because the Kushite framework was recognizably continuous with the Egyptian one. Kashta's placement of Amanirdis into the god's wife office was accepted by the Theban priesthood because the theological grammar of the placement was one the priesthood recognized. Piye's campaign of restoration was intelligible as restoration because both sides understood Ma'at, Amun, and the ritual apparatus that made kingship legitimate. The dual kingdom that Shabaka, Shebitku, and Taharqa governed was ideologically coherent because it operated within a shared religious idiom that could sustain a single sovereignty across two distinct territorial halves. The same contrast, however, had a second dimension. When the Assyrian invasion damaged the ideological infrastructure of the Kushite regime in Egypt, specifically when the sack of Thebes demonstrated that the Amun cult at Karnak could be violated without immediate consequence, the demonstration did not extend to the Kushite ideological center at Jebel Barkal. The Assyrian army did not reach Napata. The mountain, the temple, the oracle, and the royal cemeteries remained intact. The Kushite ideological apparatus, because it was geographically concentrated in territory the Assyrians did not enter, survived the encounter with its legitimacy structures functional. This is why the Kushite state, after withdrawal, was able to reconstitute itself as a coherent polity centered on Napata and later on Meroe. Its ideological infrastructure had been protected by geography. The Egyptian ideological infrastructure survived the encounter through a different mechanism. Because it was distributed across a network rather than concentrated at a single point, the damage inflicted at any one node did not extend to the others. The sack of Thebes was severe, but the Amun cult continued at Karnak within a few years of the event, restored under Site patronage. The Ptah cult at Memphis, the Osiris cult at Abydos, and the Delta cults had not been targeted at the same scale, and their continuity was not interrupted. The Egyptian system was resilient because it was diffused. It could absorb damage at any single point without losing the framework as a whole. What this contrast reveals is that the two civilizations were organized around different modes of institutional durability, and that the encounter tested each mode against a specific kind of pressure that revealed its particular character. Kushite durability was concentrated durability, a single well-defended ideological center that could survive intact even when the state's peripheral holdings were lost. Egyptian durability was distributed durability, a network of institutions, no single one of which was essential, such that the loss of any component could be compensated for by the continued operation of the others. Each mode had strengths that the other lacked. The Kushite mode allowed for coherent projection of authority into distant territory and rapid reconstitution after withdrawal. The Egyptian mode allowed for the absorption of severe local damage without loss of overall institutional continuity. Neither mode was intrinsically superior. What the Assyrian pressure did was expose which mode answered which kind of threat. Concentrated durability was well suited to protecting the core of a state against attacks that did not reach the core. It was less well suited to sustaining rule over territory whose defense required continuous exertion at a distance. Distributed durability was well suited to absorbing damage across an existing territory. It was less well suited to producing the coordinated action that a distant campaign required. When the Kushite regime attempted to sustain distant rule under Assyrian pressure, its concentrated mode reached the limits of what it could support. When the Egyptian regime absorbed Assyrian violence at Thebes, its distributed mode preserved the framework that allowed Site reunification a generation later. The relationship between Kush and Egypt during these decades did not settle a question about which civilization was greater. It revealed that each had organized itself around a different logic of institutional survival, and that these logics produced different outcomes when tested against the same external force. The pyramids at Nuri and the temple at Karnak are, in this sense, monuments to two different answers to the same question about how a civilization sustains itself across time. Both answers had substantial merit, neither was complete. The encounter made visible what each answer could and could not do, and the visibility is what the historical record preserves for analysis. The 25th dynasty ended. Kush continued. Egypt continued. The specific configuration that had briefly united them under a single sovereignty was itself a moment in a longer history that ran, on both sides, well before and well after the 90 years of contact intensified. What the moment reveals, when it is examined without the prior assumption that one side was destined to prevail, is that the resources of both civilizations were substantial, that the outcome was determined by the specific interaction of those resources with a specific external pressure, and that the pressure exposed differences of institutional design rather than differences of civilizational quality. The relationship, examined on these terms, is not a story of conquest or of failure. It is a case study in how two organized societies, working within a shared religious framework, produced different forms of durability and encountered the limits of each.